It's August 22nd, 2021, a little bit after 3 p.m. Today I am aboard my 1936 wooden powerboat Tortuga, and I want to talk about lithium batteries on boats. And basically what I'm going to try to do today is just outline what we mean by lithium batteries and a little bit about the sort of pros and cons of them. Nowadays, lithium batteries most likely means lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are a very safe variant of the lithium battery, much safer than the old lithium-ion batteries, which were noted for occasionally catching on fire. The lithium iron phosphate batteries pretty much have solved that problem. It doesn't appear to happen at all now. Also, the vast majority of lithium batteries that you're going to buy nowadays, the so-called drop-in replacement batteries, are lithium iron phosphate, and they basically have two components. They have the battery cells themselves, and they have what's called a battery management system that keeps the cells at about the same voltage, which is called balancing, and it also puts some safety limits on the battery. The battery management system usually has a high voltage disconnect, so that if you're charging your batteries and the voltage goes too high, it will cut off charging to prevent damage to the batteries. And they also will have a low voltage disconnect. If you draw the batteries down too low, it will cut off discharging the batteries to, again, prevent damage to the batteries. And there are also temperature sensors in the batteries that prevent the batteries from discharging if it's too hot or too cold for the batteries, basically at a temperature where continued discharge could damage the batteries. And also some of the batteries have what's called a low temperature disconnect, which if the batteries go below approximately 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, they cannot be charged. Now, not all batteries have that, and it isn't really an essential feature on most boats where the boat won't be used when it is below freezing. And even if the air temperature goes below freezing for a while, the batteries, which are inside the boat and stored many times at or below the water line, will be at water temperature as a minimum and probably won't go below freezing unless it gets really cold. So low temperature disconnect, while desirable, isn't absolutely necessary. The battery management system also controls the maximum rate at which the battery can be charged. For most of the sort of 100 amp hour drop-in replacement batteries, they're going to be limited to about 100 amps of charging current. And they also are controlled for how much current they can be discharged at. And again, for a typical 100 amp hour drop-in replacement battery, we're looking at about 100 amp maximum continuous discharge current. Now, it might be a little bit higher for short terms. I have an ampere time, a lithium iron phosphate battery in Tortuga now. I put it in last week, and it says on its literature that it can be discharged at 280 amps for 5 seconds. And when you get to 5 seconds, the battery management system will shut the battery off to protect it from damage due to the high discharge rate. And that, as I'll talk about a little later, has an impact on installing lithium iron phosphate batteries on your boat. But all of those factors are controlled by the electronics in the battery management system. And they're there both for safety, to prevent problems with the battery that could lead to some sort of catastrophic failure, and to improve battery life. So it's kind of a trade-off, but it does place limits on what a lithium iron phosphate battery can do. Okay, so next topic. That's what we're talking about today, is lithium iron phosphate batteries. Now, they come in kind of two flavors. There's the drop-in replacement variety, which is a box. It looks about like a group 27 to group 31 battery in size. A lithium iron phosphate battery, though, is much lighter than a lead-acid battery. A lead-acid battery, group 27 size, which might be a 100 amp hour battery in a deep cycle battery, weighs about 60 pounds, maybe as much as almost 70 pounds. A lithium iron phosphate battery, on the other hand, with the same nominal capacity, weighs about 25 pounds, which makes it much, much easier to move these batteries around. And on boats, the battery boxes are often in awkward places where it can be quite difficult to lift a 70-pound battery into the box, and it's much, much easier to put a 25-pound battery into the same spot. Now, let's talk a little bit about form factors and, what the batteries are like when you buy them. Well, there are basically a couple of form factors for lithium iron phosphate batteries. Most of them, the 100 amp hour ones, look just like a group 27 or maybe a group 31 battery in terms of size and shape. Now, the lithium iron phosphate batteries are completely sealed, even more so than an absorbed glass mat or AGM battery, because AGM batteries do have overpressure release valves that will let out vapor if the battery is significantly overcharged. Lithium batteries don't have that. They're usually completely sealed, and you won't have any. And as a consequence, you can set them pretty much anywhere you want in the boat. They do not have to be enclosed in a battery box to contain vapors. They can be in any position, upside down, on their sides, on end, however it's convenient to mount them. And they don't need quite as sturdy a mounting place as lead-acid batteries because they are so much lighter. Now, let's come back to form factors. As I said, there are batteries that look a lot like a group 27 battery, maybe quarter inch, half inch longer, about the same width, about the same height. And that's your 100 amp hour battery. And then currently, lithium iron phosphate batteries are available in 50 amp hour, 100 amp hour, 200 amp hour, and 300 amp hour rating. Now, if you consider the size of these batteries, 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery is about 13 inches long, about 8.5 inches high, and about 6 inches wide, which is basically the same as a standard group 27 or group 31 lead-acid battery. The 200 amp hour variety is the same width and height, but around 21 inches long, and they manage to cram a 300 amp hour battery into the same package as a 200 amp hour battery. So very, very compact at the higher power ratings. So you can drop a 200 amp hour 12 volt lithium iron phosphate battery into a smaller space than two 100 amp hour lead acid batteries. And you'll also save a substantial amount of weight. So those are the sort of form factors for one way of buying them, which is the drop-in replacement, which is an encapsulated set of cells with a built-in battery management system. Now, if you're a little bit more of a do-it-yourselfer, you can buy the cells individually and build your own battery. And you can also buy your own battery management system and wire it up. But to do that, you're going to have to understand how the battery management system interfaces with the cells. But that's not that complicated, and if you're even a little bit electrically inclined, you can probably do it yourself. Of course, then you're going to be relying on guarantees for the individual components, not the entire battery. But there are some advantages to doing that. First off, you can probably build a battery with whatever capacity you want for less than you could buy drop-in replacement batteries. And you might be able to pick a battery management module that more closely aligns with your battery requirements. And so save money and get a battery that meets your requirements more precisely. It's a trade-off in that you do have to, as I said, know more about electrical systems to build your own, but you can do it. And there are lots of examples out there on YouTube of people who have done just that on boats. So those are the two basic form factors. What about cost? A couple of years ago, a 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery was going to cost you $900 to $1,000. So pretty expensive. Now, an equivalent quality battery can be had for under $500. So they've dropped in the last couple of years by about 50%, which is pretty good. It makes lithium iron phosphate batteries not too much more expensive than buying quality absorbed glass mat batteries, which is what most people would like to use on a boat. But quality AGM batteries for a 100 amp hour capacity battery are going to run you in the neighborhood of $300 to $320. And that's for a battery with a rated capacity of 100 amp hours, but you're not going to want to draw it down by much more than about 60 to 65 amp hours if you want to get a decent life out of it. A 100 amp hour lithium battery, maybe you can get it for $460, can be drawn down by 80% without having a significant effect on the lifetime of the battery. And you can even draw it down all the way by 100% if you are willing to accept that you might be at the lower end of the cycle life range for the battery. Now, the battery I just bought from Ampere Time has a claimed cycle life range from 4,000 cycles to 8,000 cycles. Here on Tortuga, the boat is in the water for about 120 days a year. So if we were to say that the battery is cycled once a day, that means that if I got 4,000 cycles, the battery would be good for a little bit more than 30 years if based solely on cycle life. Now, some of the components are probably going to die before that, but what it means is that that battery that I installed a couple of days ago could be the last house battery that I ever put on this boat, which is nice. It's completely sealed, doesn't give off any gas, and it's completely maintenance free. So basically, once it's in there, other than checking to see what the state of charge is, I can pretty much forget about it, which is a nice thing. And so let's talk a little bit more about charging and discharging. As I mentioned earlier, charging and discharging is limited by the battery management system electronics. The battery I bought, a 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery, has a maximum continuous discharge of 100 amps. It can also, according to the literature, sustain a discharge of 280 amps for 5 seconds. Well, what happens if I wanted to discharge it at that high rate for longer than 5 seconds? Well, what happens is at 5 seconds, the battery management system turns the battery off, and it won't discharge at all until it resets. Similarly, if I tried to discharge it at, say, 120 amps for more than about 10 or 15 seconds, the battery management system would turn the battery off. So if you need short duration, but say a minute or two of relatively high output, your battery management system isn't going to allow it. It's simply going to turn the battery off, and whatever you were trying to do is going to stop, and everything else that's connected to the battery is also going to be turned off. So that can be a consideration. Now you can overcome that limit by having multiple batteries wired in parallel, in which case the total current you can draw from them is additive. So if I have two 100 amp hour batteries with 100 ampere maximum discharge for continuous discharge, I can draw 200 amperes from the two batteries continuously. And if I have three batteries of the same type, 300 amperes, and so on. Most of these batteries, though, if you read the literature, are limited to about 4 batteries in parallel. Some are unlimited, but most of them have about a 4 batteries in parallel limit, which would mean 400 amp hours continuous discharge limit. Now, the continuous discharge limit can have an impact on how you use the batteries. One particular area is engine starting. Diesel engines take a lot of amps to start them. If it's cold, they take a lot of amps to run the glow plugs. That can draw 40, 50 amps. And then cranking over a cold diesel engine, even a small one like the 40 horsepower engine in Tortuga, can take another 120 to 150 amps. So I would want to have at least 200 amps of continuous discharge capability to be able to count on starting my 40 horsepower diesel engine. That means a minimum of two 100 amp hour rated lithium iron phosphate batteries with 100 amp continuous discharge rating for each battery, and preferably 3, which means that for the batteries I have, I'd be looking at around $1,400 purchase price, which is quite a lot. And so in general, unless you have a really good sized bank of lithium iron phosphate batteries, they're not going to be suitable for starting your engine. Now, that said, some of the bigger capacity batteries, the 200 amp hour capacity batteries and the 300 amp hour capacity batteries, will come with a battery management system that allows up to a 200 amp continuous discharge. And one of those batteries would be marginal for starting Tortuga. And if I had a bigger engine, say I had a 200 horsepower turbo diesel engine, it wouldn't even make a dent in it. You'd probably want to have 400 or 500 amp hours continuous discharge capability. And this particular behavior is very different from what you're going to find in lead acid batteries. Tortuga currently has a lead acid starting battery. It's a group 24 size battery, which is about 11 inches long and about 6 inches wide, 8 inches high, and it has a cranking amp capacity of 1,000, and it cranks Tortuga over very easily. So, 100, you probably are going to want to maintain that $120 starting battery for a boat like Tortuga, or maybe on a boat with a big diesel engine, you might want to maintain an 8D starting battery, which can crank at about 1,500 amps, which would take a big pile of lithium batteries to accomplish. So that's a limitation in using lithium iron phosphate batteries on a boat. They simply aren't suitable for applications that draw large amounts of amperage. And so, for those applications, you're probably going to want to retain some lead-acid batteries, which will handle those short duration, high amp draws very nicely. Another thing is charging. Lithium iron phosphate batteries have very much lower internal resistance than lead-acid batteries. Now, you don't need to know what resistance means to understand the implication of that. And the implication is that with a lithium iron phosphate battery, it will accept pretty much as much charging current as you want to give it. So much, in fact, that to protect the battery management system limits the charging current. For example, my 100 amp hour battery has a maximum charging current of 100 amps. Now, a lead-acid battery, a standard 100 amp hour lead-acid battery, although it can accept maybe 30 or 40 amps, is going to be happiest at about 20 amps. And you really will not be able to push 100 amps into it. The practical implication of this is that if you have even a 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery directly connected to your alternator, that battery is probably going to take pretty much all the current that the alternator can put out. And for, say, a 75 or 80 ampere alternator, or even a 100 ampere alternator, it's going to push that alternator up to maximum output current for whatever speed it's running at, which is going to be, of course, related to your engine speed. So basically what it means is your alternator is going to be working really hard whenever your lithium iron phosphate battery has been significantly discharged. And that's going to cause the alternator more than likely to overheat, and you can destroy a standard alternator by trying to charge a lithium iron phosphate battery directly. And if you have a battery bank that contains multiple lithium iron phosphate batteries, say you have 4 of them for a 400 amp hour bank, each battery is limited to 100 amps maximum charging current. That means that they can accept up to 400 amps of charging current as a battery bank. And even the 120 amp alternator on Tortuga's diesel will be pushed up to maximum output, and it wouldn't be long before that alternator died simply from overheating. So if you're going to install lithium iron phosphate batteries on a boat, one thing you really need to do is isolate charging of the batteries from alternator output. There are 2 ways you can do that. If you have solar and you have enough solar, you can simply set up your lithium iron phosphate batteries to charge only from solar and don't connect them to the alternator at all. That's what I've done right now on Tortuga. Not because I have a huge amount of solar, but because I'm waiting for another component to arrive. The other method is to install what's called a DC to DC battery charger. And what these do is they accept current and voltage from your alternator, usually using, say, a lead acid start battery as a buffer, and they then deliver current and voltage to your lithium iron phosphate battery, but they're controlled in terms of how much current they can deliver. I have one ordered right now, I'm waiting for it, that has a 30 amp limit, so that no matter how many lithium iron phosphate batteries I have connected to the system, with that system, that DC to DC charger going between my start battery, which is connected directly to the alternator, and my house batteries, which are the lithium iron phosphate, I will never be able to draw more than 30 amps approximately from my alternator, which my alternator can easily handle, and it will protect my alternator. Now these chargers cost a little money. You know, the cheaper ones are 120 to about 150, and the better ones go up to about $250, $260 for a 30 amp output. If you have a big alternator, you might want more than that, and you can actually parallel these DC to DC chargers to get higher output. And it's pretty easy. They can talk, most of the better ones can talk to each other. They know they're parallel, and they'll adjust things accordingly. But because of the characteristics of charging lithium batteries, you need something like that. Anyway, that's where I'm going to stop today because I'm just about out of battery on my camera, and it's starting to turn itself off on its own as I get to lower camera battery settings. So I'll say thanks for watching, and I hope I've been able to clear some things up about installing lithium iron phosphate batteries on a boat. And I'll have another video soon in which I talk a little bit more about this topic and maybe go into some of the details of installing a lithium iron phosphate battery system on a boat. So all I can say is thanks for watching. If you haven't, please subscribe to my channel, and if you liked my content, please give me a like, and we'll see you next time.